Hashtag BetaHaus.
I'll take that. Hello, and welcome to another edition of the BetaHaus.Life podcast. My name is Ben, and we have in the studio with us today...
Tim
Captian is the pastor at First Christian Church in National City here in San Diego, California. And we're super glad to have you here in the studio today, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're talking about location right now, and we've had a local realtor who you know, Cassandra Altman, was in. And she was kind of sharing some different things about the city that are particularly appealing for her, and some likes and dislikes, and, just the benefits of location.
Yeah. And
this is really our move from Kentucky to here is really the first big move that we've ever made. You've got us beat. So when Beth and I were kind of knocking around the idea and trying to figure out who we wanted to have come in, it was like, we got to have Tim come in because you've covered some ground. And from your childhood until today, one location to the next, you've definitely moved further than a lot of people ever have.
Right.
So,
well, I know that probably when we first met, everyone asked me, okay, where are you from?
Right.
As a natural starting place.
Yeah.
And my go-to answer is from around. And so I probably said that to you guys too, because it's kind of hard to say where I'm from because I've moved around so many times.
Yeah. We've noticed a lot of times, like I was teaching 2 weekends ago, and I asked everybody, I said, hey, how many of you guys are not from San Diego? And like everybody at the church, about 2/3 of them raised their hands. Like, okay, good. So it was, it's just funny because we've learned to ask that, where are you originally from? Because there's so many transplants here. So if you don't mind just sharing for everybody else's benefit, where all in the course of your life have you lived?
I'll try to do it quickly. I was born in Indiana, grew up, though, in Zimbabwe, Africa, so the country just north of South Africa. So if you're listening, you can go and Google South Africa and then go north a little bit, and that's where Zimbabwe's at. So lived there for almost 8 years, and then my family was back in Indiana for a year, and then we were in Hawaii for 3.5 years, Indiana another year, Ohio, moved and then went to college also in Ohio, lived for almost 2 years in Annapolis, Maryland, and then been out here in San Diego for 7 now. So
have you calculated the mileage yet?
No, because in the midst of all of that, I've also been to several dozen countries traveling as well. So I don't know how many miles I've gone, but it's just a couple.
Yeah. So you've lived in a lot of places, experienced different cultures, even within the U.S., Midwest, West Coast, East Coast. So they're all different. They're all really different. So if you don't mind, just kind of walk us back through chronologically or not, just kind of as it pops into your head, doesn't matter. There's always something cool about everywhere when you live there.
Sure.
Things you learn to adapt to and that sort of thing. So through your experiences, where you've been so far, in each location, what is it that has stood out as a defining feature for you in each of those places?
Right. Well, I think in general, it's hard to kind of put your thumb on culture, but that is the number one thing that I think pops up to me is the community of people, because in working with nonprofits or with churches, it's all about people. It's not in a vacuum, obviously. So for me, that's the number one thing that kind of pops out versus necessarily infrastructure or different things like even nature. So in Zimbabwe, everyone used to ask us when we were coming back, okay, what was it like to have a lion in your backyard? And it was like so strange of a question because when you're growing up there, that wasn't something that really stood out to me, even though we got to see lions and wonderful nature there. But one of the things that just kind of, for me, was a focal point was growing up in Zimbabwe. I learned to talk there. I learned to walk there. That's where I learned what life was all about. And I always tell people, one of the things I love so much about Zimbabwe is the just friendly family culture that was present there. And so I remember as a kid, there was people that we would call uncles and aunts and grandparents that we're obviously not related to.
Right.
But that for me was kind of something that has really throughout my life impacted in each place I've been.
Yeah.
These little kind of almost tribalism type of culture where you're included in the family, even if maybe that's not where you're from. So that's been something I've kind of noted every place I've moved. It's been different, but everywhere I've gone since childhood, that's been something I've gravitated towards is who is kind of my extended fake family, so to speak. So.
Yeah, and that's, as you grow up, that's one of the things that you learn is that family extends beyond blood.
Right.
It really does. And that's extended into, especially when you're pastoring a group of people.
Sure.
They're deep in your heart.
Right.
You know, and so they're definitely, they're family. They're absolutely your family. So talking about family, the dynamic there in Zimbabwe, having that extended family, is there anywhere else, if it was here or Hawaii or Ohio, and yet, is there anywhere else where you had a similar slant on that from just the people around you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll go the opposite way, actually, Ben, is that even though I'm, quote unquote, from the Midwest, because I was born there and my family's originally there, both my parents are from there, it's been kind of weird not living in the Midwest because I meet other people who are, oh, you're from so-and-so place, and I go, no, yeah, but no. And so it's kind of felt the opposite. The place that I would think would feel like family or feel like really kind of tied into, I haven't been. And the interesting thing here in San Diego is this has been the place I've lived the second longest of any place. I'm hoping to pass the Zimbabwe up for the longest place in one place. But all three of our kids have been born here. And so it's been really interesting how that perspective of parenting has changed because all three of them can say that they've been born and raised in San Diego. And so it's really strange just kind of having that experience of going, when I say I'm from around, they would say, no, I'm for sure from San Diego. And so it's kind of an interesting experience there for me.
Yeah. For me, growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, I spent most of my elementary career just across the river in New Albany, Indiana. Well, that river's a hard line. People don't like to cross it. And so New Albany people, they'll occasionally pop down to Louisville. Louisville people, they have to, they'll go to Indiana. But they don't want to. And so it makes for a different dynamic. Even that close, you can have a hard separation. Kind of like we were talking earlier beforehand, a lot of people don't want to, they don't want to go north or south of the 8, or maybe Mira Mesa for North County people, that sort of thing. So, you're going to find those barriers too, in the midst of everything.
And again, that community is just different. So when we first moved to San Diego area, we didn't know what the real estate out here was. And so our natural instinct was going, we want to be as close to the beach as possible. And so we ended up in Imperial Beach. We said, it's affordable. At that time it was. And going, why doesn't everybody live here? And at that time, we just didn't understand how different of a culture Imperial Beach would be from just 10 minutes away. And so then we moved up to the North Park area, and that was completely different. Kind of just in terms of what pace of life was and compared to Imperial Beach. And now we're in National City and love it. But again, just completely different. And as we've made each of those transitions, one of the things we've just noted is the type of people that you're around is, again, just reflected in some of what this kind of sense of community was. So again, in Imperial Beach, it was mostly military families that we lived around. And so as we were building community, people were being moved and transitioned in and out. And so even our community kind of culture there was much more in flux, whereas when we were in North Park, where we lived in North Park, it was an international community. And so our kids got to kind of experience all sorts of African traditions with our neighbors. And it was a very different experience. Whereas in National City, it's just been, again, much more kind of steady, long-termers. It seems like folks that you find, oh, I've been here for 20, 30 years or something like that. And so it's been a little bit different each kind of place, even here in National City. as we've discovered this over the last about 2 years.
Yeah.
It has been really fun to kind of find out those same pieces of community are just lived out a little bit differently. And so trying to learn that and trying to be responsive to that has been a little bit of a challenge, but
Sure.
but really exciting too.
Yeah. So when we're talking about that sort of thing, and then one of the dynamics that you brought up about your childhood, I know is reflected now with where you are, talking about that, calling people aunt and uncle and aunt. That's also a Filipino cultural dynamic.
Right.
And so there's got to be a component of that feels very familiar.
Right.
Yeah, for you.
Yeah.
And for me, I never called him my uncle, you know. So you don't do that in Kentucky. That's you might call everybody cousin because it's a Southern thing to do. But
or it might be true.
Right. Yeah. They're all related. Love you guys. But yeah. So if you can talk a little bit about that. Again, just with your current context now?
Well, and the interesting thing is my wife, Julia, is almost the exact opposite of me, where she lived in Maryland for pretty much her whole life. She grew up, her family was in one house almost the entire time before we were married.
And that's crazy to me, yeah.
And so it's very, very different for her than it is for me. Whereas, again, I remember, living in Zimbabwe, at a time where internet was just for just a few folks.
Right.
You had to go through, I think it was about a 4 or 5 page command prompt list in order to manually dial into the university's internet, and then it would take you about 45 minutes to send an email. And so at that time, the kind of current state of globalism just wasn't there.
Right.
So we were really there, you know, and so my extended family all over the world. So I think for us in that, each place that I've gone, that cultural component has been there. Also, just to put it bluntly, white and also primarily Midwestern culture has a view of family that is much more place and person centric than many other cultures in the world. And so whether it's Filipino culture or, again, Hawaiian culture, where I lived for a while as well, or African culture, many of those, again, cultures have, again, this beautiful sense of what brings us together is not just this kind of sense of blood. So a good example of that has been that one of the beautiful things that our church has just done is really embraced Julia and I and our kids as part of their family.
Yeah.
And so it's been really kind of cool to see my kids as they really miss their grandparents, Julia's parents and my parents.
Yeah.
My parents live in Utah right now, and Julia's parents are still in Maryland. So we get to see them every once in a while. But in kind of a Filipino tradition, Lolo or Lola is grandpa or grandma. But it also is used for kind of a grandparent-like figure.
Okay.
And so my kids call many people Lolo or Lola throughout our church.
Yeah.
And then they will come and, respond to my kids as kind of terms of endearing love for them. And so that's been something that has just kind of warmed my heart, because that's kind of what I grew up with, and that was normative to me.
And now your kids get it too?
Now my kids get to experience
that's
that.
Awesome.
So for me, it's just kind of like a natural switch that's turned on.
Right.
Whereas for Julia, it's taken a few years to be like, okay, and what's going on here? I remember one guy, Ricky, I love you if you're watching this. But when we first came out here to San Diego and in this culture and first had kids, he, with our oldest, he would joke, okay, I'm going to take her home. Yeah. And not in a creepy child stealing way, but in
Rumpelstiltskin,
hey, I'm a babysitter, we're going to care for and love your kids and everything. And so my daughter, her response every time was like, oh, don't do that. And she'd run to me and run to Julia. And over time, and Julia was like, what is up with this guy? Yeah. He's being weird and all this. And over time, again, as we've gotten to know him and the family, and again, the church culture, is what he's saying in that moment is you're like a grandchild to me.
Right.
You can come over to my house anytime. I remember putting it this way. We call it in our house fridge rights.
Okay.
As if you get to the point in relationship where you come over to my house, you don't have to ask me to open the fridge.
Just go hit it up.
You just hit it up. You help yourself. And so, getting to that point in friendships and relationships. So I compare it to that of going like, if you know someone so well that they have the right to go drink or eat something out of your fridge without asking. That's kind of what it is like, is crossing that line into that relationship. So for me, that's what it looks like to be kind of extended family. Just like when I go to my parents, I don't have to like, hey mom, can I go get something to drink, please? Teacher, can I have... It's crossing that threshold in relationship. So that's been something that's easier for me to transition to. It's been a little bit more challenging for Julia to transition to that. And where it's played out the most is in our kids.
Right.
Because when we're personally dealing with it as adults, it's one thing. But then all of a sudden trying to figure out how to parent in that is a big change for us.
Oh, sure. Well, and the cool thing is, too, is that where a lot of this has happened for you personally has been in the context of church. Right. Which, if there's any place to break down barriers and open everything up, please,
it's kind of what we're here for, right?
So my curiosity runs around with, well, how do people adjust who don't have that connection? Beyond that, if I move to Zimbabwe tomorrow, how am I going to connect with people? If I don't have that. So I think there's definitely been a very pleasant advantage for you guys, fortunately, by the grace of God, that you all have been able to have that instant link with people through Christ that then translates into a deeper family feel and that sort of thing, which again, that's going to be heaven anyway.
Well, and again, I think as we think through this, sometimes we think of it as instantaneous of going, okay, was there a crucial moment or was there like something that happened versus again, the kind of low and slow approach of going like, how much of this have I had to be intentional about versus, again, for me, a lot of it was the advantage of growing up that way. That I didn't ever have to have this experience of going, I have to really work hard at this in the same way as Julia, because, again, for me, it's just been, well, you just live and you experience and that's how you learn. So I think for anyone listening to this, one of the beautiful things I would challenge everybody is going, you don't have to grow up in Africa. Or work at a place where you're the only white guy or something in order to become open and gain some skills socially to be able to relate to others that are different. I think what it is just getting in and practicing being a person where that is what you do. That's normal. So again, for me, it's one of those things of going, some people, I have friends who ask me, it's like, okay, what is that like? How do you wrestle with that? And for me, it's like, I don't know. I wake up every day and that is what it is. So I would encourage you, if you did move to Zimbabwe, I don't think your wife would want you to do that right now, but if you did move to Zimbabwe tomorrow, I think you'd be fine. You'd wake up the next day and the next day and you'd learn a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And over time, all of a sudden, who you are begins to reflect that. And so I think that's one of the big advantages for me. And kudos, mom and dad, for being the risky people that moved to Zimbabwe back in the 80s when things were not looking that great there. And in the midst of all of that, just again, it's a different approach to learning, is living in the midst of difference and change makes you more adaptable, I think.
So we'll jump back a little bit here. When you moved from, because you don't remember, I'm going to assume the initial move from Indiana to Zimbabwe. That one's in there somewhere.
I was a year and a half old, so don't have that good a memory.
I went to Boston about the same age, have no recollection, so not quite the same thing. But when you moved from Zimbabwe back, how old were you?
So I was about 10 years old.
Okay, 10 years old. So walk us through this. There'll be parents who watch this and they'll make moves with their children. and so maybe they benefit from hearing your take on this.
Mm-hmm.
What was that move like for you at 10 years old?
Right.
For a culture shift like that?
So I think I'll answer that question in two parts.
Okay.
So one is from like a first person perspective.
Okay.
What was I experiencing and feeling and thinking at that time? And I would just zoom in to two words, and the two words are blue bear.
Okay.
Sounds really strange, but really what that move all was about for me was blue bear.
Okay.
So I was 10 years old, and I'd had this bear ever since I grew up in Zimbabwe, and he was blue, and he was a bear, and therefore his name was
Blue Bear.
Right.
Excellent.
And so, so in the midst of moving your whole household from one place that you've lived for 8 years overseas,
Right.
One of the things as a child that I just focused in on was the things that we were going to have to give up or be different.
Right.
And so as we were going through and packing everything up and going, okay, we have to get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this. In that move, my sense of security was in some of the things of familiarity, because my family was going with me.
Right. Yeah.
And so in the midst of all of that, I was, okay, well, mom and dad, you're still my mom and dad. And we're, moving somewhere different and all this kind of stuff. And so I think all of that, any anxiety really came down to what tangibly is going to be different,
right.
In regards to things, in regards to how we function as a family. And so at that time, one of the things that happened is I guess I didn't communicate very well, that Blue Bear was like my comfort item, that special thing. And mom and dad, if you intentionally got rid of Blue Bear because I was holding too tightly or he smelled weird, I understand now. Yeah. But at the time, I was, the thing that just rocked me the most was like Blue Bear died in Africa.
Yeah.
And when we moved, I was just like, torn apart by losing this teddy bear.
Yeah.
And so personally, I think now that I have a little bit of time and space to kind of look back, I go, again, I think that for me was like the symbol of change, was that my childhood, my growing up, my not necessarily innocence, but the thing that brought me personally comfort was now gone.
Right.
And so in the midst of that huge shift, maybe parents, you can start noticing some behaviors in your own kids. And in the midst of this, every kid is going to respond differently. But what I can speak towards my personal experience is going, all of the energy of change for me was focusing on, okay, what is happening to my childhood?
Right.
And so that is kind of one perspective, is just, again, zooming in on that very specific item and that thing, I think is helpful for me as I parent my kids and help them deal with different transitions. Looking back as well, and kind of a much bigger picture, the thing that I wasn't prepared for culturally was a shift of belonging. That when we moved back, one of the interesting things that happened was everybody is interviewing you, even as a child, asking you and kind of approaching it from, you must be so happy to come back to where you belong. Meanwhile, it was an experience for me where going like, well, I belong in Zimbabwe, because that's home, And so a lot of times people will ask missionaries or people who grew up in another country, like, oh, isn't it so great to be back home in the States or to be back, or using language of going, it's normative for this to be the center of the world and center of focus. Meanwhile, let us investigate all the strange and weird things of wherever it might be.
Right.
And so in the midst of that, again, a much bigger picture is parents preparing children for this kind of investigation of weirdness.
Right.
So for folks who'd been in Indiana or Ohio, I remember meeting people who had never left their county. Okay.
Wow.
Never left their county before.
Yeah.
had trouble finding countries in Africa on the map, let alone knowing that Africa was not just a country, it's a continent.
Yeah.
And so in the midst of that, really kind of being like, oh my goodness, you know how to eat with a fork? Like, I thought everyone there was
bread and fingertips, man.
And so in the midst of all the different personal changes, I wasn't prepared for this kind of otherness of going, it's really weird or strange. I think parents and all of us really, as we approach other people, our natural curiosity for otherness and for differences, unfortunately, might, if we're not careful, play out as going, oh, isn't it so much better now that you are here versus there. So there's all sorts of ways it's played out in funny different ways. So one of my memories of coming back is I was homeschooled in Africa. My family chose to do that rather than sending me off to boarding school, and the public school system at that time was just not in a good place. So came from homeschooling. So in order to get enrolled in 4th grade, they had a simple entrance exam. And so it's basically flashcards. And so they're showing different things that for any person in Indiana would be very normal to kind of
Bobby
flip
Knight.
up.
Basketball.
And so one of the things they flip up is they flip up this animal that has this bushy tail, right? And it's eating a nut. And so obviously for anyone from the Midwest, it's like, squirrel. Okay. So I answered mongoose. It's kind of like the weird looking mongoose, but the person giving the test looks at me like, what? Is this person daft? What is wrong with it? And so on and on, like different things, and they lift up the seasons, right? So you should by 4th grade know your seasons. It's simple stuff. And so they lift up one that has a bunch of water, and it looks like somebody's holding an umbrella, and you go, oh, that's rainy season. And they go, okay, let's try the next one. They lift up another one, has a big sun on it, and it looks like it's hot, and you go, oh, that's dry season. And then all of a sudden they lift up a third one, and all the trees are dead. And you go, I don't know. It's that drought season? That's really bad. And then they lift up one that has all this white stuff on it, and you go, I have no clue. What is going on? And so all of these different things that are ingrained in the cultural piece of things, the unspoken, in a much bigger perspective, some of those really silly things as a child were what was hard about walking into class for first day. What was hard about playing on the playground or being introduced to other families was not just the walking through the door, which for a lot of kids, if you have first day, you know how kids get nervous about first day, right? And so some of the underlying pieces of comfort for first day is knowing where you're going, all those things. But it's also going, well, what am I going to talk about? So I think one of the things that, all of us are learning. And so one of the things I wish my parents had the chance to do, that a lot of mission organizations now do for missionary kids, is going, okay, here's some coaching, here's some training, not just on social skills or something like that, but in coaching, okay, so just so you know, when you walk in that door, you're not going to see a person of color. And the reason is not because they don't exist, but because this is where you live, and this is the history of Indiana. I had to learn all of that. And it just wasn't assumed of me that I would be able to flip that switch socially to do so. So I think that was a big thing that now looking back, I go, oh, okay, that's where some helpful parenting and coaching could help children make that shift in their lives.
Well, that's a lot of stuff that, again, most people, they're not going to think about. I mean, because when we moved from Kentucky to here, there were some cultural shifts. But it was nothing to that degree. The seasons felt weird here. We had to we know what they are now. We've experienced them. We're on our second round. And okay, I get it. I understand what winter means here. And you can still go to the beach. Well,
and for some people, again, for Julia, it's not moving internationally, but there's still every single year for us she mourns a little bit around Christmas time because one of the kind of cues for holiday, one of the kind of cues for emotion about, feeling off and on vacation for a certain time of year is that it gets cold and that it starts to snow. And so when it's 70 or 80 degrees in November, she's like, I don't know whether I'm ready for Thanksgiving because I just don't feel cued towards that. And so I think that's exactly right. For every one of us, we, in these experiences, whether we're adults or children, it's the slight differences sometimes that get us more than the big ones.
Yeah. Because on the other end, I really don't mind 73 and sunny, and just in general as a lifestyle, I'm okay with that. But yeah, there are those times of year we're making those transitions. And, being prepared for those as you make those moves are good. Any other formative events in regards to transitions from moving one place to another for you that maybe kind of stand out like that initial one did?
Well, I mean, I could just go on and on. Obviously, pastors are good for talking for a long time. But really, there's been kind of time and time again moments where I would kind of explain it in terms of the broadening and narrowing moments.
Okay.
So meaning when you're kind of at point A, and then there's a whole slew of options before you. And those are sometimes moments where I've struggled of going, okay, well, how do I even choose? And it's not apparent of going, okay, well, this is clearly where we ought to go. And so that has been a change and that has been different. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be something like a big change or a big moment that's like, okay, clearly this is life-changing moment, but more like, okay, well, it seems like one is to go in a very different direction than the other. So a good example of that is out of high school. Man, I was a nerdy nerd, and if you know me, I'm still a nerdy nerd, and I love it. But the way my brain works is, like we were saying before, in lists, and in and you can give me 0.1 through 5,000, I'd be very happy. And so I was thinking about going into the Navy, and was being recruited to be a nuclear engineer on a submarine, and man, that just spoke to kind of who I was. And the other kind of avenue that I was kind of feeling like, okay, well, I also want to help people. And at the time, I didn't really know what that looked like. My dad was a missionary / pastor. And so, obviously working in the church, was like, okay, well, I could go do that. But at the same time, my personality was like, I don't know that I like being around people that much. And in order to work for a church, you kind of have to be around people all the time. And so in that moment, in those, probably a year or two where I was trying to figure out, all right, where do I go? What do I do? One of the things that was so helpful that I just am so thankful to my parents for is instead of helping me narrow it down to one thing in that moment, they said, okay, what if you try something for a time? And so that's where I wasn't ready to fully commit. And you need to be ready to fully commit if you're going into the Navy. And at the same time, I wasn't like, hey, I have this full commitment towards church ministry either. And so they're like, okay, what we're going to do is you're going to start off with a general ministry degree, which means that you kind of do a little bit of everything. And you're going to go and try it out for 1 year. And so them helping me have this parameter of 1 year, try it out. I have room to go do something else. At the same time, it was finite. So it wasn't just like, well, go in 4 years or 5 years or 10 years and good luck. But I think that was really a life-changing moment for me because in that year of kind of trying some things out, experimenting, getting different opportunities, meeting different friends, is where that I look back and I go, wow, I did not know beforehand how crucial that was going to be. I did not know beforehand that I was kind of frozen because of too many options and choices.
Been there.
And the kind of overwhelmingness of going when you're 17 or 18 years old and you're like, this decision is going to be the rest of my life. How do I even choose? To be able to narrow it down to go, okay, I'm going to do this for 1 year. It's going to be okay if I don't end up going down any of these avenues or paths, but I'm going to be intentional to learn and try to experience what God is going to call me to do specifically. So I think that has been another maybe example where I really, again, give kudos to my parents of going, okay, wow, that was, I don't know whether it was intentional, but it was genius. And giving me that help in the broadening and narrowing process.
Yeah.
So
that's good. That's really good. So this is not a question on my list.
Okay.
So I'm going to bounce around a little bit here. But
I've only killed 3 people.
Yeah. The difference between, because you've mentioned this, is like Julia's family, you know, and people in Indiana who are used to living in one location.
Sure.
Forever. That's just totally unusual to me. And then to have people who, it's not an unusual thing to move from one apartment to the next apartment to something else. When you're familiar with moving, it's a lot easier to move.
Sure.
And, you know, city to city moving is a bigger deal. You know, we've got some friends that just moved a couple of friends that have moved from here in San Diego up to LA for work related reasons.
Right.
And it's kind of like they have to have like little goodbye parties. Yeah, I'll come back down. It's 2 hours away, but it's 2 hours away.
Right.
You know, so there's a just enough distance thing to keep you from maintaining those old relationships the same way. But if you had to give advice to somebody who's always lived in one place,
yeah,
and now you're moving somewhere else,
right,
that's going to be remarkably different, what would you say would be the best way to prepare yourself to make those type of moves?
Right. Well, again, I just start by saying that first and foremost, even as Julia and I have different experiences, being able to validate both.
Right.
And going, you know, there's not necessarily a right or wrong in terms of our growing up experiences of going, shame on you for living in one place. Shame on you for moving all around.
Right.
There's obviously childhoods that are destructive either way, whether you're staying in one place or moving all around. So I think being able to affirm in you first and foremost, and I'll speak to you right now, Ben, of going, it's okay. There's a blessing in that.
Right.
One of the things that for me growing up, I always wished I had lived in one place or stayed in one place because just several things that come with that of when you get into school and everyone's known each other since kindergarten and again, different pieces of things like that would just be easier in some cases if you lived in one place.
Right.
And so it took me a long time, probably until I was an adult, to really just embrace my experience and going, you know what, that wasn't my experience. It had some disadvantages, but at the same time, it really has some really good things that come with it. That you have maybe a better sense of community, a better picture of long-term change in one place, which unfortunately I don't have.
Right.
So when you grow up or you stay in one place for a very, very long time, you're more likely to notice, oh, that building changed, or this thing happened in the community, or the leaders in the community were able to affect long-term change, not in 1 year or 3 years, but in 15 years.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily just the stability that is a huge factor, but it is, okay, well, what does it look like to affect long-term change in a family, in a community, maybe in an organization or a church? Because the disadvantage that I have moving around is going, if somebody were to come and say, okay, you see all of these problems in your community, it's not going to take 2 years, it's not going to take 5 years, it's going to take 20 years to affect that change. And I go, well, 20 years, I've never lived in one place for that long.
Years,
I have to go to others and go, okay, what would that look like?
Right.
So I would affirm in you going, hey, there's things that you know, that you have experienced and you've been able to learn. And so not kind of forgetting that. So, you know, I would never ask anybody to forget their personal experience because, again, out of that personal experience comes a lot of wisdom to both good and bad things. So that would be primary thing is to validate first. And then the second thing I would do is to go, okay, moving to a position of listening. Mm-hmm. And so this is one thing that we tried to do very intentionally when we moved to San Diego, is we intentionally set out for the first 6 months to a year to pretty much not speak too much towards the culture as if we were coming to speak something to solve some kind of problem, because honestly, we didn't know what was needed. And we had a sense of going, hey, we're here to serve, we're here to help. So we had a lot of dinners with people. We listened a whole lot. We said, hey, tell us. And so there's all sorts of different kind of funny moments where, again, being in a posture of learning puts us in a better position to kind of find our own place in the community. So a good example to me was I did not fully know Filipino culture. I still don't. But I started to learn pretty quickly because there's just different cultural moments or cultural things. So if anyone knows what circumcision is, don't Google it right now. But in Filipino culture, typically it happens when the boys turn 13, which is a very different experience than if young babies are circumcised. And so I did not find that out until several years in an embarrassing way, where in that moment I go, oh, I need to listen and learn, and otherwise I'm going to be in a position where I put my foot in my mouth and end up embarrassing myself. So one is validating your experience. Two would be again listening well. And then the third thing is, unfortunately, and I think this is something that's typical both for Christians, but also for people who are white, is to try to change towards dominance. So meaning where we would come in and go, okay, the change that's needed is that you become like me. And that has been something that we have to search out in our own souls to make sure that as we are making that move, so whether it's for work or family or why we move doesn't matter, but oftentimes when we enter, maybe we listen well to go, oh, that's great that you're over there. Now come here. It's great that you're like that, but now you need to be like me. And so one of the things that I think is helpful here is I do some marriage counseling as well, is encouraging a couple, okay, when the two cultures of your individualness clash against each other, having a common vision of goodness, of unity, of what your marriage is going to be like in the future. And so the same way in the community is going, if you're doing well listening, we don't have to discard our own experience, but we're also not asking them to discard their experience. Instead, we're creating a vision of going, okay, well, together, now what is next? So that is the 3-step process, oversimplified, but to me is validate, listen, and then kind of reimagine and re-envision what's going to be next. And so as you walk through that, I think that helps naturally the change process, because it doesn't all have to happen in 2 weeks or immediately. It is a thing that honestly takes years, I think, for that change to be played out. So that's my thoughts and opinion. I don't know whether that's all right or not, but
well, you're again, being a pastor, 3 points is kind of the way we operate. So okay, so Tim, at the end of our episodes, we like to give our guests an opportunity to plug shamelessly whatever it is that they want. It may be the work that they do, maybe it's their favorite band, a new restaurant that they found. So the mic is yours. What are you up to?
Man, how long do you have? I'm just kidding. No, we have a couple things going on at our church that we're excited about. One is we've just launched a whole new early learning center for kids birth through age 5. So we are the largest early learning center in all of National City, and the only one that is actually licensed for kids under the age of 2. And so this, we believe, is a way that is just going to really positively impact families economically. So find out more information on adventurepointkids.com, adventurepointkids.com. And so we'll be starting to get kids enrolled and everything like that pretty soon here. So we're excited about that.
When is it planned to start up in September, or when does that enrollment begin?
Here in May, June of 2019.
So soon.
Yes.
Very soon.
Right around the corner.
Cool. This episode will come out in May.
Yep.
Yeah. So it'll be right on it.
Yep. So check out adventurepointkids.com. And again, that will be a great way to, if you're in the National City or South Bay area, a great place for families with kids.
That's awesome. Anything else you want to promo today?
Well, if you're in the San Diego area, and sometimes listeners who listen to this kind of thing ask me, okay, what would be important for us to help our community out? And so there's a lot of different ways to do that. One of the things I'd encourage listeners to look up is look up 211. If you're not aware of what is going on in our community, 211 is this wonderful network of agencies, it's nonprofits, churches, all across the board that offer help to those in our society who need help. So look it up, get familiar with it. If you ever find somebody is in need of whether it's housing or whether it's food or anything like that, there's this wonderful network. So it works like 911, except instead of dialing 911 for an emergency, you dial 211 and they will have an operator there who helps you. So our church is one of very many who help provide food. So we're a food bank provider. And so if there's other organizations that would like to get involved, 211, man. Give them a call and look them up online. And again, it's a great way here in San Diego. That is pretty much the model of how so many other large cities in the U.S. are trying to do it. They are looking at what's happening in San Diego. So it's pretty cool.
That's awesome.
Encourage folks to get involved with that.
Go San Diego. All right.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, Tim, thank you so much for coming in today. Really appreciate it, brother. And glad to sit down and we always take a selfie in the middle of, or at some point in the process. So Beth has her phone over there, and so this will actually become part of our thumbnail stuff too. So lean it in here a little bit. Okay, thank you, and again, thanks for coming on, and glad to get to share this.
Hey, my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm looking here at this camera. So if you are joining us on YouTube today, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to mash the bell down in the corner. So when the next episode comes out, you'll get that notification. And if you're listening to us on one of the myriad podcast formats that we're out there on, make sure that you give us a good rating and give us a review, write some comments in there so we can respond to you. And that'll make it easier for other people to find us a little bit later on down the line so they can hear this awesome message that you just heard from Tim Captian today. So until next time, adios.